Don't put your yield at risk, put your trust in proven solutions. Anvil Nitrogen Stabilizer, Super U Premium Fertilizer, and Tribune Nitrogen Stabilizer from Koch Agronomic Services. These products offer higher active ingredient concentrations imitator brands can't match. See the difference at defendyourn.ca.
You're listening to Ruminating with RealAg, the podcast that chews on the latest in beef production, with your host, Amber Bell.
This is Ruminating with RealAg, and I'm your host, Amber Bell. For today's episode, I am thrilled to have Grant Lastiwka joining me. Now, Grant currently works with Renovo Seeds. He also provides support for the Forage and Research Associations in Alberta through Erica. And he used to work for Alberta Agriculture and Forestry as a beef and forage extension specialist. So he has a lot of background on weed management, which is what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. Hi, Grant. It's great to see you again.
Nice to see you too, Amber.
So we're going to be talking about weeds today. And
Yes.
I think this is a problem, or maybe it's not, but it's a problem that a lot of people have in their pastures.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Right. And so different areas in the province, we're going to get different weeds, but I think that there's some basic management principles that we could probably broach on. Let's just to lay some of the groundwork though, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see producers facing in your work?
What I think I see is the challenge of flexible grazing, adaptive multi-paddock, as many people will call it now, or systems that are managed dynamically. Because when we have different years, and every year in grazing is different, no year is the same, we need to be flexible enough to deal with that. And if we're unfortunate to use a lot of rigid nature, what we find with that is we put the invaders, the weeds, in an upper hand position, and our plants that we want to be there for us to graze and we desire in, unfortunately, a lesser position.
Right. Do you have an idea of what the actual economic impact might be on, I know that would really depend on how weedy a pasture is, but do you have an idea on how much it actually impacts forage quality and forage availability?
There's no doubt, depending on the type of weed, you've got more opportunities to push cattle out of an area. And if it's a heavy patch of Canada thistle and a deep-rooted system, how does it affect it? If it's buckbrush, are they going to walk around patches and not graze within it? So there's a lot of the economic side of it is coming more to the forefront, Amber, all the time, simply because of land prices, also because of the reality of how costly it is to winter a cow. We really want to improve our grazing, and the economics of the grazing in summer is pretty crucial. And I think it's becoming a larger disadvantage when we've got invaders in the stands, but putting a value on it is a hard thing to do.
Do you know if there's a way that producers could get an idea of how much weed issues in their pastures are impacting their numbers, their profitability?
The problem with it is people don't adjust the numbers to reflect the decrease in productivity, the change in grazing that animals are exploring.
Right.
And as they graze differently, it disguises it. And lo and behold, we go from one year to the next managing, but at the same time, the weed population continues to grow. And
Hmm.
as it continues to grow, we're getting into a worse and worse situation because the degradation of that pasture by it's so subtle with us. We'll see invaders coming in the range world, we'll call them increasers, and they're simply plants that are grasses that are not as productive, but
Hmm.
they're also invading weeds. And we start in losing the grasses we call decreasers in the range community, or the ones that we rely on for more resilience in varied weather conditions. So the whole picture of economics is a complex one, and grazing days based on management, grazing days based on monitoring and controlling are more accurate than just trying to look at it and put a number on it, unfortunately. And the lack of growth later in the season may be because of the type of plants that now have invaded, or very simply because of the overgrazing of the good plants as the animals switch and shift how they do things. And so it's a double whammy, if you want to call it that.
Right. And I think sometimes as producers we'll think like I don't think everybody considers the grazing day impact. It's more, some of the impacts, the negative impacts that weeds will make are, hey, well my animals, the nutrition has dropped that they're getting. So maybe their gains are dropping. Maybe, there's those impacts. But yeah, those grazing days are definitely a loss out in the pasture.
They are. And the dilemma with grazing days is, did you have a grazing day where an animal had a full rumen? And so often we find, and Dick Diven, when he used to teach the precise nutrient course, would say, if you want to argue with somebody, start talking politics, religion, or dry matter intake. And the idea behind that is cows grazing fresh air and sunshine, where there isn't the forage availability and the rumens aren't full, but they still are grazing high quality baby plants that are high in sugars from stress and overgrazing, are offsetting. So in fact, what we have is it's harder to do like a feed bunk system where you put feed out and you look at how much is left in the bunk. The reality in a pasture is it's disguised over time and hidden in so many ways that people really don't know their impacts. Calf gains because the milking ability of the cow dropping aren't as good this year. And we blame it on a lot of things. And I've got to admit, saying it, blaming it on the weather is one of the biggest problems actually I see.
Right. There's a lot of blaming it on the weather. Let's go into some of the management techniques. So typically, a lot of people spray. What are some of the differences between grazing versus spraying? And how would a well-managed grazing system actually impact those weed populations if you're comparing that to a herbicide? Like what would growers be looking at if, say, they're currently out there spraying, but they want to go to more of a grazing technique to manage weeds?
We've always said to people that the best weed control is a competitive crop. And the idea of a competitive crop in the grain world is understood, and a competitive crop in the grazing world needs to also be understood. So when we've got plants that are healthy and vigorous coming into the fall, when they're setting up next year's growth, lo and behold, they start 2 weeks earlier growing in spring. And the weed that could have found its window of opportunity, as some of the weeds that do start earlier do, doesn't have it to be as competitive. And so the level of weed encroachment ends up being minimized. And the weeds appear for many reasons. The reality of them is they are so often a symptom of a problem versus the problem itself. And if we're going to deal with the problem, then understanding the fact that if we use a herbicide to do with it, it could be an effective tool. But if we're not going to change our management and we're not going to manage that ecosystem from a point of trying to put the pieces together thoughtfully, all of a sudden it's a very expensive investment because it will be back, haunt you not too long into the future.
Right. And what about length of time that it takes to establish? So, because you talked about using a herbicide possibly as a tool if necessary with a change in management. Now, if you were to go just a straight change of management, do you have an idea of what that might look like how long you might until you see a difference in your pastures?
It could be very quickly. And the reality of that is that weeds are opportunists. And so what we're trying to do is damage that opportunity. Whether we have a high enough stock density at a time to get trampling of the weeds, whether we have a high enough stock density to get grazing of the weeds, and maybe we choose to move animals more rapidly and it could concentrate stock density. to try to get the forage grasses that are present or legumes left in a high degree of vigor and health for the regrowth, and yet have an impact on the weeds by biting or trampling and other things. So with a system like that, we can have a fairly quick opportunity. The biggest opportunity I see is trying to put together the rest and grazing period management properly so that the plants that are on the pasture have an opportunity to be vigorous and competitive. And at times, maybe it is fertilizer you bring in that is a purchased input. Other times it could be just making sure you've got a water source and availability so that the animals aren't mining the land and moving nutrients into the trees or onto a hilltop or into a water body. So we're trying to close the system so that the plants that are present in it are impacted, but also they are taken care of. And with that, we hope the most competitive plants that have been there for a while will step back up their game. And as they step back up their game, they compete against the weeds and push the weeds back.
That makes sense. Okay, so if we talk about the type of weeds, because I know I have heard from a lot of producers that'll say, yeah, okay, I can manage these weeds, but what about this one, right? Whether you're down south and it's burdock, or you're up here where I am in the Westlock area and it's tansy that's everywhere. What about those really hard to control, hard to manage weeds?
Well, and as you talk about the tansy ragwort is the poisonous one that common tansy is not. And so the reality of some of our friends that you know from the past graze tansy. And with animal stock density and other things, you certainly can. The weeds that are in different parts of the province are going to require, every weed's different. It finds a different opportunity. It finds a different home, a niche that fits for itself. So you're looking at trying to understand it, look at its life cycle, and with understanding of its life cycle a bit, try to hit it when it's down.
hmm Those ones that you can graze. So I know we've talked about this in the past, and I know there's people that train their animals to graze
Yes.
certain weeds. So can you go into that a little bit and what that actually looks like and the efficacy of it?
Okay. Kathy Voth from On Pasture, and this is a shameless plug for Kathy and all the wonderful work they do on Pasture website out of Colorado. But Kathy was one that was teaching people how to train animals to eat weeds. She started with goats, but at the time, nobody wanted to own goats. So then Kathy decided she was going to use some of her skill set to adjust the system and to provide what is good, solid principles, like you mentioned at the start, Amber. She looked at competition of animals. She looked at positive reinforcement. She looked at the familiar, and she looked at time to adjust to the unfamiliar. The reality of animals are it's a lot of learned behavior in grazing when one looks at a calf watching its mother. And out of Utah State, Dr. Fred Provenza, who Kathy worked with, by the way, also was one that showcased the fact that learned behaviors from mothers have a large impact on it. What Kathy then looked into was the fact that, if we look at our impressionable years, as we all remember when we were younger and we left home and started to go to school, we all of a sudden had teenagers as we got older. And so Kathy looks at the fact that when you leave home a little more and you're starting to get in the rebellious teen years, looking at replacement heifers and knowing that they are not as ingrained in their grazing management as an old cow. So she worked with those and setting the stage for them to go from familiar, go from a little competition to consume feeds they're familiar with, to in fact then adjusting over several days. So it was a repetition too. And she went to several days of changing from familiar grains or pellets and such to something the animals had to work their mouth around, like cubes or such. And in so doing, you were finding that she had thistles, or she could have had uh, um, tansy put into some of the tubs she was feeding because she wanted them to try to consume them. And the animals had to stick their head in to compete against each other a bit too. And with all that, after about 7 days, she had an impact on the animals. And now it's up to us to keep that ingrained more. And with doing that, she found the animals did evolve to grazing more of the plants she put in front of them. And so, as long as you're doing that thoughtfully and wisely, and you're never asking them to eat junk, you're asking them to balance their ration and realizing that, yeah, tansy when it's young is not that bitter. Canada thistle, you might think it's got spokes on it and it's going to poke your tongue and hurt it. It doesn't, like you think. And toad flax, and I've certainly tried myself, and when you do feed tests on it, you find when it Canada thistles in the bud stage, toad flax is starting to flower, they're still high quality feedstuffs. So the idea of putting animals in there and having them consume these now becomes part of a ritual with them. They're not going to go in there and clean down a patch per se, but they're going to graze it as part of their ration. And with that, it's simply leveling the playing field.
It's really interesting because a lot of the weeds do actually have a high nutritional value. I had learned a
Yes.
little while ago that humans can eat Canada thistle, and I haven't tried it. I have not yet taken the prickles off of the
You're
Canada
not
thistle yet
slurring
to
your
try it.
words, so I don't think that
Right?
thistle.
Um, but apparently you can eat it, and it's like eating celery. Or with our cattle, if we had stinging nettle in the field, if they had had a mineral supplement, the stinging nettle would be
Yeah.
the last thing they'd eat. If they had not had a mineral supplement, that was the first thing they'd eat going into a pasture with it. So it's really interesting that I think through our process of babying cattle, we have actually created picky eaters.
Oh, yeah. That is one of the challenges we often say to people when people look to extend their grazing season, is that there are many opportunities for these animals to do it. And some people will talk about, using snow as a water source. It takes a little trained behavior and a little adjustment. You start looking at cows uncovering forage through the snow. And the reality is, as my good friend Jim Bauer would say, cows love to graze. And so we try to understand how to work with them and how to entice them to do things and try to make it easier for them to do the right things. And so if it's find the swath in the snow, that's why so many people will say, we put our fence across the butt ends of the swaths. So the animals, when they start, if the snow is really deep, they're starting on something that's been opened already.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, the idea that we work with the animals and monitor and control our situations with the weeds is true too. And I don't want people to go out there and annihilate a pasture thinking that we're going to get those Canada thistles. When Dr. Ed Bork at the University of Alberta did it with Sue de Bruin, they did actually do that at the start, but then they gave it a hugely long rest period. And
Hmm.
lo and behold, that was trials at Rimbey, Alberta, and they found that, yeah, the thistles were pushed back. But the key was also the rest period to go with it. And I always get worried about people trying to do something early in the year because that's at a time where our plants have just come out of the spring. They're trying to recover. And so if I'm doing something with a Canada thistle's life cycle in thought, I certainly would like to see it grazed to try to keep it a little more vegetative. And when we were feeding our heifers that, my daughters went out in June and were clipping our buds of our Canada thistle. But then we want to bring the animals back in August when the Canada thistles are putting down nutrients for the winter and then get that once severe grazing on them. So we're going to try to make them start to regrow going into winter without replenishing what they've given to the cattle in nutrients. And with that, we're hopeful that we're allowing enough rest and we had healthy, vigorous grasses or legumes with the thistles so that when next year comes, we've pulled ourselves down a little bit in the amount of thistles that are so happy to get started.
Right. So because there are a plethora of weeds that a producer might need to manage within their field, would you recommend that, let's say they have burdock, right? Would you recommend that they look into learning how burdock grows, what it does, and when its weak moments are before just like flat out being like, this is how I'm going to handle this?
Absolutely. And I think in a lot of this, we look to our grazing community for mentors. And as we do, we're trying to find those people that have been there, done that. And be careful though, because like anything, we're getting stories and we're getting anecdotes. And so you're trying to be a detective and get through it. So do your diligence at looking up the plant and how it does function to understand it better. And at the same time, draw on other people that have done things because there are injurious plants. And so if I'm grazing foxtail barley when it's very vegetative, I don't have jaw problems or such. If I waited until I've got a really mature plant, then I could have. So we don't want people to put themselves into an injury situation for animals like burdock can be, but we're trying to understand how to manage it. And if we're going to have to use a herbicide to set it back, then how can we work with animals thereafter when it's more vegetative, when it's younger, before it's injurious, and trying to have those animals now become the resource. So it's an ecology of management, it's ecology of animal behavior, and it's monitoring, controlling thoughtfully, and keeping track of what you're
Mhm.
finding.
That's a really good point too, is taking notes. Um, let's move into sort of multi-species grazing. And do you see a value
Yes.
in putting other animals out with the cattle if it's possible when it comes to weed control?
Absolutely. The fact of the matter is that, like Kathy Voth, we can work on trying to change animal behavior so the cattle are more in tune to doing things. And we all know if we've got cows from the prairies or we got cows that come out of the bush, they graze differently. And the aspen can be very high quality in spring, in June, when we put them in it with low tensile strength, and we can get that encroachment of aspen pushed back. The reality is sheep are going to consume similar to cows, but a little more browse or a little more forbs, I should say, maybe so, even better. Then I go to the goats, of course, and goats are ones that really like to do damage to shrubs and to brush and such. So if we're looking at leafy spurge, we often see people turn to sheep for that form of a weed. When we look to buckbrush or bush encroachment, aspen encroachment, then a lot of the times the goats could be very good because that is part of their learned behavior. That is part of their genetic makeup, literally, in other countries, where that is a lot of the foodstuffs that they were bred for, that have cultures that they work really well in. And all those years of experience when the goat industry came into Canada more than ever has genetics that go back to learned behaviors that haven't changed so much. And so goats are one that really do a good job at getting into some of those harder to control weeds and going with their smaller mouths, and sheep too, and split lips, the ability to put their mouth around something and take a leaf off a burdock maybe and not be problematic with the burr, and in
Mm,
so doing removing the factory that is in fact building the plant. In so doing, what they're doing there is using it to their advantage, unfortunately at the plant's disadvantage, which is what we want. So yes, the idea that these multi-species really do have a place. It's just because that's more of their genetic makeup, and that is their learned behavior at a strong point.
The differences between sheep and goats and the way they graze is really interesting to me too. When I was trying to decide whether to get sheep or goats, I actually wanted
Yeah.
sheep. That was my thing. And but we have mainly bush land around us. And so when looking into it, I was told by a friend that no, you're going to want a goat then because goats aren't going to, or yeah, goats aren't going to really want to graze the lawn, and sheep are going to want to graze the lawn a lot more than the goats are. So it's really interesting. Do you know if goats will have the same impact because they're still ruminants? Would they still have the same impact to like tansy, let's say, as cattle, like causing abortions and
If it's tansy ragwort, when it's common tansy, it's a misnomer. The reality of common tansy is that it might have some anti-qualities in it, but it's not tansy ragwort
hmm,
that causes the abortions. So, just understanding our plants a little better and knowing that, that actually is being said, but it isn't. And I wouldn't say never is never, because in agriculture, we're always learning. But the reality, if it's consumed as part of a ration, and animals don't try to make a lot of mistakes, because as Dr. Fred Provenza and Kathy Voth took advantage of was post-digestive feedback. And the idea is once you eat it, if you don't feel sick, if you feel okay, or if you feel like you mentioned with the hemp nettle, a little Pepto-Bismol, oh, that is satisfying a nutrient deficiency.
hmm.
It met its demands. And there was a satisfaction, I can't say the right word. If there was an animal being satisfied by it with feedback back, and
Hmm.
that's something I don't think we give enough credit to animals because just like us, when we're eating something, if we've got a sweet tooth or something, we do like certain things. And so we're trying to help other animals. And I don't want animals to be forced to only consume a leafy spurge if they're sheep. So we try to give them that patch as part of it and let them mix their rations because if given the opportunity, they will take care of themselves. And unfortunately, if not given any opportunities, they might make mistakes. And that's something that we really don't want to be bringing down on anybody.
Right, definitely. And let's talk about soil health because you know I love soil.
Yeah.
Um, so when it comes down to what is happening, what weeds you're going to be seeing in your pasture, I have heard that there are, whether it's different bacteria that and fungus that's in the soils will promote different weeds. Can you go into that a little bit and kind of can you tell what's happening with your soil by what you're seeing above ground?
Absolutely. The reality is, as we talked a little bit in the conversation, ecosystems, and they're functioning above ground. They're functioning by us, in fact, changing them, adjusting them. And as we do that, above ground and below ground are also changing. And as we look at our landscapes, we're just exploring and trying to understand below ground. And there's a lot of conversations being had. But when you look through a lot of literature, you'll find that the holistic ecosystem, broad approach of trying to understand is still one of many learning lessons. We know that when pastures are very high in bacterias, thistles can predominate and really like that situation as we manage for a lot of good principles of grazing management, plant diversity, plant health and vigor, feeding the soil organisms. And when we look at the fungi that are really functioning based on a bartering system with the plants, we're looking at healthy, vigorous plants giving exudates to the soil. 40% of what they take in sunlight energy is going below ground. So who's it going to? Who is your friend? And your friend with different plants can be a system like the fungi. And as the fungi ratio to bacteria ratios start changing, so do what happens above ground in the plant pasture. And some of the nutrients that we look at in balance, micronutrients, macronutrients, all are part of a story of understanding. And as the soil organisms you brought up, how many hundreds and thousands types of bacteria do we have? And there's nematodes, there's protozoa, there's the fungi, and all of these coming together in a matter of coordinating their function. The earthworms take it so far, then the next step in the food chain comes along, and away those bacteria or protozoa go, and the nematodes, and then we just work our way down until we get more soil organic matter. And the beauty of soil organic matter is it's built on the backs of the soil organisms. So everybody at past used to say, well, it's important to leave litter on the ground for converting it to organic matter soil. Well, the reality is it's an impacting of the soil species that is as largely as we know now at this point in time. Soil organic matter is built based on the soil organisms dying and their structures becoming part of it. And as we get that, we see different weeds weakening. Mm-hmm. We see different plants flourishing or not. And with all of that, we're looking at systems functioning that is a learning journey right now that we're fully into and got a long ways to go. But it is in our own minds, in the end, what we end up with is more soil organic matter. And if we're not all the way to a peat soil in soil organic matter, for every percent soil organic matter, we've got about 12 pounds of nitrogen that is going to be released into the system annually. So that's beautiful in terms of building the competition of the plants. And with the competition with the fungi adjustments, I can't say weeds won't be there, because the reality is that weeds are real opportunists, and we're moving feed around the country. We've got birds that fly. We've got wild animals that move. And the challenge with drought ends up being so often that the deeper rooted, the invader species find a foothold in there. And so one of the things I think we have ran into in the last several years is drier conditions than we want and weeds proliferating. And yes, there are some weeds that have come in like absinthe wormwood that are really taking advantage of the dry conditions, the severity of grazing of some of these pastures. And at times, white cockle's another example. When you fertilize, it says, thank you kindly, you get a chamomile or oxeye daisy. And when you fertilize, it's pushed back. So every weed's got a different spectrum to understand.
Let's talk a little bit about that seed bank. You mentioned that briefly there. And I think the seed bank is something that's misunderstood. However, I could be wrong in that. Because the reality is we have weed seeds in our ground. Even if we don't import any hay, anything like that, there is a seed bank of weeds that is there waiting for the right conditions. So how much of an impact, if you're doing good grazing management, say bringing hay in that might have some new weeds to your area, how much of an impact does that have, and how much concern should growers or producers being put into what they're importing in their land?
They should be concerned. The reality is, let's deal with what we've got. Let's not add more things to the puzzle and problem. And it is something that is a concern to me, because it's hard. I'm still, after 1987 was when my brother Benny and I put our first controlled grazing system together. I'm still learning, Amber, and I'm getting pretty old here, but maybe I'm slower than a lot. But the reality of all of that is that weeds, once they're in there, are truly an opportunist. And so many of our weeds are introduced weeds from other countries and other things that our healthy native grasslands didn't have to deal with. The soil itself is a seed bank. And you and I have ran into people that have had native grasses coming back into stands that were in cropland for many years. And you're thinking, where did that come from? And some of the work that was done in the US on organic farms and such found thousands of seeds in a seed bank in the soil. And many of those don't last so long, unfortunately, or fortunately, many do. And with all of that, they are present. They are waiting for those opportunities that come, breaking dormancy, or very simply a lack of competitive growth. So out comes that opportunity. So it is something that in my own mind, I want to keep on top of. I know that just because I sell seed at times, I'm not saying that weeds don't come in seed, because the seed production of perennial forages does have some weeds in it that are a challenge, simply because how we grow our perennial forage seeds. But the reality of all of that is that there is so much in the soil already. And I've been to some person's place and I look across the road and I think, you're not going to have a lot of luck, because the neighbors overgraze. There's oxeye daisy everywhere on that piece of ground. And all you're going to do here when you've got wild animals that don't know about fences, winds, wind currents, how they can be in fact, and we have more winds now, people will tell you, than previously, be it because of the trees that are coming down and other things across the country. But yes, weeds travel. And unfortunately, as they travel in our systems, it's important for us just to be on top of them as best as we can and nip them in the bud.
That's a great note. And just as we wrap up here, what would you say to a producer who had some serious weed issues last year, is concerned going into the spring? What would you recommend as some first steps to changing grazing management come the spring?
Perennial plants set up their life cycle based on a 365-day growing mentality. As my friend Jerry Tellier once said, we would like a 365-day grazing mentality, but perennial plants are setting the stage for next year in the latter part of the year, in the fall and such. And if we don't leave them with a lot of groceries, what we have in the spring is a disadvantage. And one of the best weed controls we can have is to try to allow those plants to replace the nutrients that were consumed in the winter, because the word dormant is maybe the wrong word. I like to look at it as more of a hibernation. And those plants are respiring sugars to survive through the winter. And that's coming at a cost, because in the spring, when they initialize growth, it could be from a green leaf that's starting to regreen because it had lots of sugars in it, and the ability to maintain its antifreeze, if we want to call that, and not freeze. Or it's got tiller buds that were in fact created last fall, weren't aborted, were there to be lead tillers and come early in the spring. So that's why you'll see that don't graze it too soon in the spring. The biggest thing there is trying to get it to a time when its operating load is at zero, and that's about the 3.5 leaf stage of a plant. But the answer is a little more complex too. So the fall sets the stage for spring, the spring sets the stage for the year, and unfortunately, ecosystems try to maintain a balance. And don't expect them to say, oh my God, this is the greatest opportunity ever. We're just going to grow like crazy. They're looking over their shoulders, kind of saying, okay, what happened last year? Okay, I'm maybe going to do a little more this year, but if the year goes well enough, maybe the fertility's adjusted, maybe the grazing management adjusted, I'll set up more tillers in the latter part of the year to be more productive next year. So the shot of a fertilizer blend too might be a tool. I say to people, it is also dealing with a symptom of a problem. It is also an opportunity. So I say everything's a tool, and use it wisely, and use it with understanding the good plant's life cycle. Also use it understanding the bad plant's life cycle, and work within that, making your adjustments.
Well, I really appreciate that, Grant. This has been great, and I know you and I could talk for a lot longer about this, and we have. So I just want to thank you for joining us, and that was Grant Lastiwka on Ruminating with RealAg.